Today, Carl Jung wrote near the end of his life, "We are again living in an age filled with apocalyptic images of universal destruction." Jung was addressing what had become, after the conclusion of World War II, the defining conflict of the times. As he saw it, the Cold War reflected the state of modern humanity's psyche, with the Iron Curtain as its prevailing symbol. "This boundary line bristling with barbed wire," he wrote, "runs through the psyche of modern man, no matter on which side he lives. Even the normal individual sees his shadow in his neighbor or in the man beyond the Great Divide." Jung went so far as to assert that it had become a political and social duty to perceive the other as the very devil, so as to fascinate the outward eye and prevent it from looking at the individual life within. In Jung's view, the mass state, his term for government and its structures, has no intention of promoting mutual understanding and the relationship of man to man. It strives, rather, for atomization, for the psychic isolation of the individual. Jung asserts that when we come to perceive the other as someone to be feared and shunned, we risk the inner cohesion of our society, allowing our personal relationships to become undermined by a creeping mistrust. By walling ourselves off from a perceived other, we flatter the primitive tendency in us to shut our eyes to evil and drive it over some frontier or other, like the Old Testament scapegoat, which was supposed to carry the evil into the wilderness. The effort to push away our individual and societal shadows is undertaken in the hope that we might quickly and conveniently sink into the sea of forgetfulness and reclaim our sense of normalcy, however vague and distorted. But in reality, Jung warns, nothing has finally disappeared and nothing has been made good. The evil, the guilt, the profound unease of conscience, the obscure misgivings are there before our eyes, if only we would see. Jung urges us instead to recognize the self-same nature of the other, to declare, "I am guilty with the rest," to understand that none of us stands outside humanity's black collective shadow, and ultimately to accept evil as something lodged in human nature itself, as the equal and opposite partner of good. In his work as a psychologist, Jung argues against the division of the psyche, the dissociation between good and evil, the bifurcation between the conscious and unconscious selves. The goal of psychoanalytic therapy, as he saw it, was not to bring life into some sort of harmony, but to engage in a process he called individuation, the opening up of a dialogue between our waking consciousness and the often repressed preoccupations of our unconscious mind. He saw individuation as a path toward discerning wholeness in seemingly irreconcilable opposites, a way of holding darkness within the psyche, a way of learning to live with the chaos and disorder of our lives. For Jung, understanding dreams was an essential part of this process. "Dreams are the guiding words of the soul," he wrote. "Dreams pave the way for life, and they determine you without your understanding their language. If the events of our waking lives were filtered and given an extra layer of meaning through dreams, then the unconscious held essential clues for coming to terms with hidden anxieties and preoccupations. The dream describes the inner situation of the dreamer," he wrote. "But the conscious mind denies its truth and reality, or admits it only grudgingly. In order to begin a true reckoning with our inner situation, we have to expose ourselves to the animal impulses of the unconscious without identifying with them and without running away." To illustrate his point, Jung offered the following example. When you dream of a savage bull or a lion or a wolf, this means it wants to come to you. You would like to split it off. You experience it as something alien, but it's just something all the more dangerous. the urge of what had been split off to unite with you becomes all the stronger. The best dance would be, please come and devour me. I arrive at the coffee shop each morning at 6:30, half an hour before the first customers. I ground pre-weighed beans and started the drip machine, filling 3 insulated airports with coffee. I dialed in the espresso grind, weighing and timing each shot until I got the right yield, the right ratio of grounds in to liquid out. I turned on the water tower. I displayed bags of whole bean craft roasted coffee in neatly arranged rows. I set up a pour-over station with scales and glass carafes and ceramic V60 drippers made in Japan. I unlocked the retail refrigerator full of Italian sodas and green glass bottles of sparkling water. I set out the chocolate and vanilla and caramel syrups. I filled an insulated pitcher with organic half and half and restocked the to-go station with hot sleeves, stir sticks, straws, lids, napkins, and raw sugar packets. I walked across the courtyard to fetch ice from the commercial kitchen. Then I unfolded the wooden shop sign in the courtyard, removed the closed placard from the countertop, opened the register, and set out my tip jar. The coffee shop was one of many retail outlets in a shared marketplace, a small business complex situated around an open-air courtyard in the style of an old Spanish mercado. At 6:30 in the morning, I encountered few other workers as I puttered about. The pastry chefs at the Mexican bakery, the prep cooks at the taco shop, and the maintenance man who maintained the mercado grounds, a strong and clean-shaven man from Oaxaca named Jose, dressed always in a black baseball hat and a gray t-shirt stretched taut across his broad shoulders and tucked neatly into a pair of black jeans. Jose would clean the surface of the courtyard with a garden hose or a long-handled push broom. He regularly cleaned the adjacent sidewalks with the leaf blower, rippling small waves of debris toward the street gutters to be swept away by monsoon rains and hot summer winds. He arranged the courtyard furniture, unlocked doors with the keys dangling from his waist, punched in codes to disarm the security system, and opened the gates of the mercado to let in the day's first customers. Jose and I often talked to each other across the counter of the coffee bar in the early hours before the morning rush. We spoke in Spanish, exchanging cordialities. He asked about my graduate studies, about my travel plans, about my luck with women. He asked about my family, and I asked about his. He asked about my mother, about the health of her heart, and he would ask that I greet her on his behalf when I left the city to visit her. I asked him in turn about his wife and 3 boys. He stood proudly with his arm resting on the countertop the day his oldest son started high school, smiled broadly the day his youngest boy won his first soccer tournament, and leaned in firmly on the broom handle the day his middle son was hit by a car. He's getting better, he would say 4 months after the accident, gracias a Dios. Jose knew I had spent several years in the Border Patrol, but he rarely questioned me about the work, almost as if there was not much to ask. Likewise, I relinquished certain questions about his arrival and status. In my day-to-day interactions with immigrants, the customers at the coffee shop, the workers I encountered throughout the city, the day laborers who came to the park to play pickup soccer with my friends and me in the evenings, I often recognized subtle marks left by the crossing of the border, an understanding of its physical and abstract dimensions, a lingering impression of its weight. I sensed this knowledge in Jose as well, but there was little way to speak of something so imprecise, and so we regarded each other with nods and silences, with glances and gestures, with something that soon became friendship. One day, as I stood counting tips at the end of my shift, Jose pulled up a chair at the bar and sat to drink from a bottle of sparkling water. As I changed out a pile of singles for a $20 bill, I could feel his eyes resting on me. I looked up at him, and he motioned for me to come near. "Oye," he said, in a hushed tone. When you were in La Migra, you must have made good money, que no? Sure, I said. He looked around to make sure that no one was within earshot and then leaned closer. More money than you make here, que no? I laughed. Claro que sí. He leaned back in his chair, confused. Entonces, ¿por qué lo dejaste? I shrugged, somehow surprised that he had finally asked. In the end, I said it wasn't the work for me. I avoided his eyes, thinking of what more to add. Finally, I looked up at him. I wanted to go back to school, I said, study writing, earn a master's degree. Jose gave me a mischievous grin. A student doesn't make much money, he said. I chuckled and gestured at the small pile of tips on the counter. He looked at me unbelievingly. You could make more somewhere else. But I like the peace, I said, and the people are nice. I pointed at the espresso machine. The coffee's good too. Jose laughed. Claro, he said. Todo el mundo necesita café. Jose continued to look at me curiously. Why study writing, he asked. Why not business, medicine, politics? Así podrías ganar más dinero. I shrugged again. Writing seemed like a good way to make sense of what I'd seen. Jose sat back in his chair. Ah, ahora te entiendo, he said. I could write many books, he added after a while. He visto muchas cosas. Jose and I often spoke of the drug wars and the disorder swirling in Mexico. The 43 students who disappeared in Ayotzinapa, the endless cartel shootouts along the border, the persistent corruption of police and government officials. One day he told a joke. There was this big deer hunting contest, he began, with hunters from the U.S., Russia, and Mexico. On the first day, the Americans came triumphantly before the judges. But the carcass they presented was so destroyed by their high-powered weaponry that it was unrecognizable as a deer, so they were disqualified. On the second day, the Russians brought in the body of a large buck. But when the judges discovered the animal had been poisoned instead of properly hunted, they too were disqualified. A third and fourth day passed, and still there was no sign of the Mexicans. On the fifth day, the judges finally decided to go looking for them. After several hours of searching, they found him in a clearing in the woods, huddled around a rabbit. One of them was torturing the animal without mercy, while another stood over it, shouting, "Confess you're a deer, motherfucker." On the day the Mexican military captured El Chapo Guzman in 2014, Jose asked me, "Do you think it's really him?" "I don't know," I replied. "Do you?" "I'm not sure. He has body doubles, you know." Jose paused. "Or maybe the government made arrangements to arrest someone who looks just like him." Several days later, Jose showed me pictures that had turned up on the internet. Zoomed-in images of the drug lord's face side by side with pictures from his prior arrest in 1993. "Se ve diferente," he said, "que no?" I studied them. "Puede ser," I offered. He set his phone on the counter and stared at one of the photos. "He doesn't really look like a drug lord," he said. "No se ve tan malo." I poured him a cup of coffee, and leaned against my end of the counter. "You never know," I told him. "Violent people look like everyone else." Jose looked up at me. "When you were on the border," he asked, "did you ever find drugs?" "Sure," I told him, "more than you can imagine." He nodded slowly, his eyes unblinking. "Did you ever arrest a narco?" "Sure," I said, "but not like El Chapo." Jose listened intently. We mostly arrested the little people, smugglers, scouts, mules, coyotes. I watched as a knowing look spread across his face. His eyes met mine and held them until I turned to look away. But mostly I arrested migrants, I confessed, people looking for a better life. Around 9 or 10 in the morning every day without fail, Jose brought his breakfast to the coffee bar and sat at the counter to eat. He ate the same thing each morning, a vegetarian breakfast burrito from the taco shop next door, and every morning he offered to share it with me. "Vas a querer burro?" he would ask, and most mornings I would accept. "Grab a knife," he'd say, "cut it in half, take however much you want." I made him coffee in exchange, always in a paper cup, flavored with a shot of vanilla and a splash of half and half. He often commented on the quality of the burrito. "It's good today. The beans are cold. There's too much salt. There must be a new cook." He would comment on the salsa. "It's watery today. It's not spicy enough." Sometimes he would even come to me before ordering. I could order black beans instead of pintos. I could add avocado. ¿Qué te parece? Some days Jose would offer to split a dessert with me, donuts or yellow cake from the bakery next door. One morning he brought in breakfast made by his wife. Comida típica de Oaxaca, he told me. He offered me as much as I wanted. "I ate like this all the time," he said, smiling. As I ate from his Tupperware, I told him I had once arrested 2 men from Oaxaca. Jose's eyes grew wide. "Oh, sí?" he asked. "They were good people," I told him. "Gente humilde." Jose smiled. "Así somos en Oaxaca." "They shared their food with me just like this," I told him. I described the beef jerky, the grasshoppers, the dried fish. Jose beamed, his eyes hungry and sparkling. "Carne seca," he said. "Chapulines. Charales." "But the best part," I continued, "was the mezcal they gave me, made by their father right there in their village." Jose sat back and opened his mouth. "Ah," he said, "el mezcal es muy bueno." Jose leaned on the counter and shook his head, looking down at the wood grain. "Yo antes tomaba mucho mezcal." "My cousin, he makes his own mezcal. He harvests the maguey from around our village. We used to drink it straight from the still." He gazed out the window and across the courtyard. "Fui alcohólico," he admitted quietly. He straightened his back. "Pero ya no," he told me. "I've been sober for 15 years, ever since my first son was born." Day after day, month after month, every morning at the coffee shop was the same. Jose would complete his daily tasks and then come to the counter to talk and share his food. For nearly 2 years, there wasn't a single day he didn't come, not a single day he didn't sit down and offer to break bread with me. One morning I asked Jose about his home in Oaxaca. His village was small, he told me, nestled in the jungled mountains south of the capital. "It's peaceful there," he said. "So far the violence hasn't come for us. Where I'm from, the people are humble and hard-working. There's little money to be had," he said, "but in my village the people still haven't turned to drugs and killing." Later that morning, during a lull in business, he came to the counter with his smartphone. He opened Google Earth and spread his fingers across the screen, bringing close the state of Oaxaca, the green hills surrounding his village. He smiled longingly at the satellite image, pointing to neatly cultivated fields at the settlement's edge. "There is where my cousins make their mezcal," he told me with glinting eyes. In street view, he pointed at colored buildings and cracked roads. "This is the church," he said, his voice far off and trailing. "This is the municipal plaza." I interrupted our conversation to refill coffee mugs, to take the order of a customer, but each time Jose remained at the counter, absorbed in his phone. "Look," he called to me, "it's my mother's house." I walked over and he pressed his finger at the screen. "You can tell by the arches." He sat back in his chair, smiling. The first time my mother took me to Mexico, I was just a boy, still unable to grasp and file away memories. She took me by train through the state of Chihuahua to a place called Casas Grandes, site of the ancient Mogollon settlement of Paquimé. "I wanted to go to Mexico with my little boy," she would later tell me, "because I wanted him to grow up knowing the border, to see it as a place of power, a place of discovery." My mother had just separated from my father and was seeking to prove to herself that she did not need protection, that she could travel as a single woman in a way that trusted people, in a way that imparted this trust to her son. When we arrived at the town near the ruins, my mother took me to a market next to the station and asked the man working there if he knew of a place where we could stay. My mother remembers how the man smiled at her without menace, how he referred to her, for the first time in her life, as señora instead of señorita. He wrote down the name and the address of a woman with a guest house nearby. "She doesn't like to take in many people," he said, "but she'll take in a mother and her child." Later that afternoon, after leaving our belongings at the guest house, my mother remembers going with me to a small plaza. She remembers that there were women and children there, that the women greeted her warmly, that one woman even gave her a hug before bending down to speak to me in Spanish. The woman introduced me to her little boy, and we ran off together to play on the steps of the gazebo as my mother joined the other woman. My mother tells me that never before had she felt so accepted by a group of women. She describes the moment as transcendent. It didn't matter that her Spanish was poor, that she came as a tourist from another country. It didn't matter, she says, because we were mothers. The next day, the man from the market drove us to the ruins of Paquimé. When we arrived, my mother found that the park was closed for archaeological work. But the men who worked there, seeing that she was a mother, seeing that she had come from so far away with a small child, welcomed us to walk through the ruins. As we walked, I became fascinated by the men at work. Before long, I was improvising a game of cowboys and Indians. I would hide behind a rock near the workmen and then pop up with my arms outstretched and my fingers pointing at them. I would make the noise boom. My mother remembers how one man stopped what he was doing to clutch his chest and fall backward, feigning death. She remembers how I laughed with delight. She remembers how another man threw down his tools to jump behind an ancient mud wall. He popped up with his fingers aimed at me. Boom, he said, and I jumped back in surprise. My mother still remembers how I ran laughing through the labyrinth ruins that afternoon, chasing and hiding from the workers. She remembers losing sight of me, but remaining calm. She remembers trusting me, trusting the place, trusting the people around us.